Thank you, Mr Acting Deputy President. And at the outset today, I just want to make mention that I am feeling a bit stiff this morning. I played rugby on Saturday, first time for about 5 years. I'm feeling very, very worse for wear. Not much to report from the game to the Senate, except that the refereeing standard was much better on Saturday than it was on Friday night, unfortunately, as a Queensland Senator. I just wanted to put that on record. And I also want to say that we're here to talk about regulation, and regulation's a bit like refereeing. You can't live with them and you can't live without them. Unfortunately, sometimes it's very frustrating, the referee's decision, the umpire's decision, and sometimes regulation's very frustrating too, Mr Acting Deputy President. But we do need it. We do need regulation in our economy. We do need regulation for a variety of things. But it's also very important that we take stock from time to time to make sure the regulations we have are fit for purpose and the regulations we have aren't redundant, because these all come at some cost to small businesses in the economy. And if I could just take a moment to respond to the previous Senator, Senator Billick. Unlike Senator Billick, I'm not going to question the motives, ethics or objectives of the other side. I'm not going to call them childish or somehow that we want to, I don't know what it was, we want to take things away from not-for-profits or something like that. We're apparently evil. We're all evil on this side of the chamber, of course, Mr Acting Deputy President. We come in here every week just to see what we can do wrong to the Australian people. I don't think the other side are like that. I don't think they're like that at all. I think they come in here with fine objectives. I think the crossbenchers come into this place with fine objectives. We all come here to try and do the best by our nation. But I do think those on the other side sometimes fall short of those objectives. It's not a question of their motives, but it's a question of their competence, Mr Acting Deputy President, and that's why we've had to do things like this repeal day this time. There's an old saying, Mr Acting Deputy President, that you take care of the pennies and the pounds will take care of themselves. And I think that's something that the previous speaker hasn't or has forgotten, the merits in such a saying, that yes, some of these changes are small and minor, but it doesn't matter if you're in your business or in your family or in your own personal life. You do the small things right. You do the small things right, and the bigger results will take care of themselves, Senator Billick. So if you get correcting a comma might mean a small thing to yourself, but it's about getting it right. Because if we get those small things right, the sum of those parts will make up to a better result. And if I can refer back to that disastrous game on Friday night too, again, while the Cowboys were very much dudded by refereeing decisions, they have to take some responsibility themselves too, because they didn't get the small things right in the game, particularly in that first half. They missed some tackles, some crucial tackles, and they lost the game as a result. The same thing here with this bill. We need to take care of what is important, well, even the small things, even if we don't think they're important, because they make a big difference. Because small changes over time can add up to a lot. And I just want to go through one statistic that is not a statistic that I came up with, but someone I used to work with at the Productivity Commission came up with this, and I think it's quite indicative of the problem we have here, Mr Acting Deputy President. Back in 1936, we in this place, or in the old place, enacted a bill called the Income Tax Assessment Act, which is still with us today. Back then, in 1936, it took us 120 pages to administer income tax in this country. Today, well, actually today I think it's just over 6,000. It's come back a bit, but back when this statistic was done, it was just over 7,000 pages. In about 80 years, it had gone up 7,000 pages. Now, if that growth rate was repeated, so in the next century, the next 80 years or so, if we continue to grow the Tax Act at that rate, by the end of this century, the Tax Act will amount to 830 billion pages. It will take, yes, billion, that is right, Senator Ludlam, it is billion. It will take 3 million years to read, or about that amount, and it will weigh the equivalent, Senator Ludlam, of 20 aircraft carriers. That's what I'm reliably informed by Mr Ralph Lattimore of the Productivity Commission. Now, that's the power of compound growth, of course, but we are not, fortunately, I don't think we are going to end up with a Tax Act by the end of the century of 830 billion pages, partly because over the last decade we have realised as a nation that we've been regulating too much, that red tape has gone up too significantly, and there has to be a response. And as I said earlier, in the case of the Income Tax Assessment Act, that has started to come back in terms of page length. We've also had in the last decade, about 10 years ago now, the commissioning of a red tape reduction task force by the former Howard government. It's been known now as the Banks Report, chaired by the former Chair of the Productivity Commission, Gary Banks. And it was really a start of a process, I think, Mr Acting Deputy President, which did say, look, we've done all these other reforms in the economy. We reduced tariffs, we deregulated financial markets, we floated the dollar, but there was another big agenda there, and that was getting rid of some of the regulation which had accumulated over time. That report found that there could be $7 billion of savings if we did tackle these issues. Now, by no means have we done everything which that report recommended, but we have made a start. We made a start by including it in the national reform agenda in the last couple of years of the Howard government, and then, as the previous senator said, the last government came to power with great plans to deregulate. They created a deregulation portfolio. They moved the Office of Best Practice Regulation from the Productivity Commission to the Department of Finance. I'm not sure if that was such a smart move. And they did come up with a seamless national economy agenda with 27 regulatory hotspots and 9 areas of competition reform that they wanted to focus on. Now, they did do some things, Mr Acting Deputy President. Some of that agenda did come through, and some of it was worthwhile. For example, they did remove some overlapping regulation on wine labelling in the last government. I remember the former chairman of the Productivity Commission giving credit for them on that. He gave a speech in late 2009 where he said, "There is now commendable focus on advancing reforms to some 27 regulatory hotspots that add to the cost of doing business across jurisdictions. But no reforms, other than wine labelling, have yet been implemented, and less than half are on track for completion within the original timeframes." Now, Senator Billick did refer to the Code Reform Council report, and finally they were a little bit tardy in some of meeting those timeframes, as the former chair of the Productivity Commission said in that comment. But they did get around to completing 20 out of 27 of the hotspot areas, but they left 7 off, and some of those 7 were very, very important. They were worse on the competition reform areas. Less than half of those were dealt with, according to the Code Reform Council. So there was a lot of unfinished business left by the former government. One of those 7 that were left off were the changes to the EPBC Act, which we've debated in the last sitting period here, which now I see, after the Labor Party identifying that area as a regulatory hotspot as long ago as 2008, 6 years ago they identified that area as something that needed to change, more bilateral agreements, less overlap between jurisdictions. They are now, 6 years later, opposing those changes, Mr Acting Deputy President, and that's to great regret, I think, because it's been one of the areas identified by the Productivity Commission, by the Business Council of Australia, that needs significant reform and reduction in red tape. But at the moment, those changes are held up by those members on the other side. By the senator there, Senator Billick, who spoke earlier. They are being held up by their opposition. In the former government, we also had there was a process by which you could remove yourself or get around the requirements to do a regulatory impact statement before a regulation came in, and the former government had 80 breaches of that standard. They did not prepare a RIS properly or fully in 80 times, and they included some very important changes, including the carbon tax, including the financial advice reforms that you know well, Mr Acting Deputy President. That led to some problems because we had to change those things, and when we came to government they weren't done. Now, because we have that unfinished business, we've had to take some action coming into government to try to keep that going. Now, I know the former senator said this is a stunt and why are we putting aside a day or 2 days a year? Well, I say to the former senator, sometimes in business and life you've got to set yourself goals, and you've got to set aside specific timeframes to meet those goals. And we all agree, I think, across this chamber, that we need to reduce red tape and we need to reduce regulation. Now, the best way to do that is to try and set aside some time where we actually do it. That's what I find in my life, Mr Acting Deputy President. If I want to lose weight, and I do need to lose a few more kilos, I need to set aside some time to do exercise. If I want to improve the relationship I have with my kids, which I certainly need to do as well, I need to set aside some time to spend with a family. And likewise here, as a good administration does, we want to reduce red tape, so we're setting aside some time to reduce red tape. We're doing 2 days a year. We will start those reductions. With this bill that we're here to talk about today is one of those bills among many that we've introduced. And really, when you talk about regulation, there are two main things you want to try and focus on. When you think about red tape, we often focus on the stock of red tape. We want to focus and reduce that. When I spoke about the Income Tax Assessment Act, that's an example of the stock of regulation. and that does need to be reduced, certainly, and this bill tries to do that in a number of ways, which I'll talk about in a second. The other thing we must be always mindful of is to reduce the flow of bad regulation as well. And the 80 breaches of the regulatory impacts guidelines of the former government is an example of not taking account of that flow of bad regulation. And we've also introduced some reforms recently in this first year of this government to tackle the flow of regulation, not just the stock. But if coming back to the stock, and the Omnibus repeal bill that we're debating today is an example of dealing with that stock, and it does remove a number of things which will benefit people across our economy and in business. For example, it will remove building certification requirements in the aged care sector that duplicate requirements with the state level. So we'll get rid of that overlapping regulatory burden, and that will save about $3.42 billion in annual compliance costs. These are the kind of commas and rounding errors, apparently, that the former senator said that we're doing here today, but a $3.42 million saving is a pretty good saving in my book. The ozone, we're also making changes to the Ozone Protection and Synthetic Greenhouse Gas Management Act 1989 to reduce the burden on low-volume importers, and that will save about $420,000 in compliance costs. Not as much, but still, I wouldn't sneeze at $420,000, even if the Labor Party would. And we've also making changes to the telecommunications sector, which I think have been mentioned by previous speakers. So there are changes here that will make a difference. Overall, this Omnibus repeal bill will streamline 14 acts. It's going to repeal 43 acts and amend 27 acts. So it is a start. It is only a start, Mr Acting Deputy President, but it's a good start. There are other changes that we've made in this first year which have made a difference, and I think the former senator mentioned, there's not many people that are jumping up in the streets and and lauding us for our changes. Well, that is the want of most governments. Most people don't give you a pat on the back. But I tell you what, I know people, and I've spoken to people in the agriculture sector that are very, very happy that we've changed the egregious and very destroying legislation regarding the ag-vet sector, the agricultural and veterinary chemicals sector. That was a terrible bill that was introduced by the former Labor government on the assistance of the Greens. It was only done, I believe, because they were in partnership with the Greens. It was going to ensure or force all agricultural chemical companies to review or to go through a new regulation project every 7 years. So even if a chemical had not had any bad effects or any reports of health or safety issues, it would have to go through another set of regulatory hurdles every 7 years. To underline how stupid that was, it was going to be a more onerous regulatory regime on our agricultural chemical sector than it was for pharmaceutical drugs and medicines, which are obviously can be much more harmful to our community, but they don't have to go through hoops every 7 years. But the former Green Labor government, the Green Labor Party, decided that needed to happen to our agricultural sector, and our farmers paid the cost. Now, fortunately, I think maybe the last thing might have been the sitting period before, I think, we removed that. We removed those changes, and I applaud the Labor Party for actually supporting that removal too. So it showed quickly how stupid that was, because the Labor Party, in less than a year, have changed their mind on that bill. Other changes are very important too. I've already mentioned the EPBC Act changes, which we're pushing through, which are going to unlock billions of dollars of projects and approvals. There's also changes to the personal property securities legislation, which is an arcane piece of legislation. But if you lease or have on some kind of hire purchase arrangement equipment, you need to make sure that goes on a register in the case that someone is facing foreclosure by banks. And at the moment, you've got to do that within 90 days. We're going to extend that out to a year, which is actually quite important, because I just spoke to a grazier in North Queensland a few weeks ago who was falling foul of that legislation because he hadn't registered some cattle that were on agistment, and the banks turned up at a place and subsequently sold that cattle that weren't actually the owner of the property's cattle. He was just putting them on agistment. And now this change that we're introducing would have actually saved him. So another change which actually benefits people out there, Senator Billick, but because there are some positive things that we are doing here in this legislation. We're also, as I mentioned earlier, you've got to deal with the flow of regulatory changes as well to make sure red tape doesn't accumulate over time. And we're also doing things to tackle that as well. We are going to make sure that Cabinet submissions now do have a regulatory impact statement attached to them, and the deregulation function of government is being moved into the Department of Prime Minister and Cabinet to make sure that process works. All ministers have established deregulation units within their department that are tasked for this, tasked with the deregulation focus. And very importantly, we are actually linking remuneration to senior executives in the public service to meeting their deregulation targets. And in my view, in my experience, from my time at the Productivity Commission, this is the most important change, because the accumulation of bad regulation is largely a result of bad incentives in the public service. It is not a consequence of bad intentions. There are not people in the public service that want to punish business, or not in my experience. They want to do a good job, but the incentives aren't really there at the moment within that framework. And one of the worst incentives in government is that for a government and for the public service, regulation can seem costless, because often there are two ways to tackle with a policy problem. You can introduce a regulation, or you could perhaps spend some money. And if you take the latter course, if you spend money, well, then you have to make a budget submission for that money. It requires a huge amount of bureaucratic effort to get that money assigned to you. But if you come up with a regulation, all the costs are not on the public service or the government. They are then borne by largely the private sector or the not-for-profit sector. And those incentives ask you, and there does need to be a very specific focus on making sure that when regulations are made, that they are fit for purpose and are designed with the costs that are being, the external costs, if you like, the costs that are being imposed on the business sector, that those are taken into consideration. Now, despite all this good work that I think we are doing, Mr. Acting Deputy President, there is no doubt that there is more to be done. And I was listening closely to Senator Bilic's contribution and hoping that she would come up with some ideas, because she did say she wants to deregulate. The Labor Party want to deregulate, but I didn't hear any ideas of actual bills that should be deregulated or changed. I just heard complaints. I heard our motors being impugned. I heard us being called pathetic and childish, I think was another one. But I do have something positive to try and contribute in my own small way, Mr. Acting Deputy President. I do think that we do need a couple of more things need to be done. We haven't had a proper stock take of all of our regulations since the National Competition Policy process finished in 2005. There's about 2,000 regulations that process went through, and a recommendation of the Productivity Commission after that process in their NCP review in 2005 did recommend that we should do another stock take, a priority stock take of some very important areas. I believe that hasn't properly been done, and we should focus on that and take up that recommendation of the Productivity Commission. I also think that we do, going forward, we're making these changes, and they're good changes, the changes I support, but they may not work as well as we intend. We must recognise that, and we must recognise that there is some scrutiny of what actually is happening after we make these changes. And I do think we'd benefit from some more independent advice on those changes, whether it's regular Productivity Commission reports or some other organisation or some other review. That needs to be kept in mind, in my view. But ultimately, Mr. Acting Deputy President, this is a very important change because, as other speakers have alluded to, we've had declining productivity performance over the past decade. And it hasn't just been declining here in Australia, it's also declining relative to other countries in the world. And we must realise that while many of those reforms from previous decades, like opening up the economy, like deregulating financial markets, have reduced costs for our country and made us be able to compete more, the overburdensome regulations in this country has been something we haven't quite tackled as well. And when you open up an economy to the rest of the world, like we have done in the last 20 or 30 years, the costs of those regulations become even more keenly felt because those businesses now are not just competing against someone down the road, they are competing with someone over the oceans. And those countries might not have the same regulatory restrictions, and we need to always keep in mind that we as a government don't make people's lives out there harder than they need to be, that we don't make people who want to make a buck and employ people, we don't put unnecessary barriers in their way. Thank you, Mr. Acting Deputy.